Imagine a place where the winter never ends, where the wind screams across the frozen plains of Manchuria, cutting through skin like a razor. It is 1936. The world is on the brink of war, but here in the shadow of Harbin, a secret city is rising from the snow. 15045. To the local farmers, it looks like a fortress. High concrete walls topped with high-voltage wires. Watchtowers looming against the gray sky. Massive smokestacks belching black smoke day and night. When the locals ask what happens inside, the Japanese officers smile politely. They say it is a water purification plant, or sometimes they call it the Eastern Lumber Mill. They say they are processing wood. They say they are cutting logs. 45-1-20. But there is no wood here. The trains that arrive in the dead of night are not carrying timber. They are carrying people, men, women, children, snatched from the streets of China, Russia, and Korea. They are brought here in windowless cattle cars, huddled together for warmth, terrified of the unknown. They think they are going to a prison camp. They think they will be forced to work. They are wrong. Once they pass through the iron gates of Pingfan, they cease to be human beings. Their names are erased from the record books. Their past lives are incinerated. To the scientists in white coats who walk these sterile hallways, these people are no longer fathers, mothers, or daughters. In the official documents of Unit 731, they are referred to by a single, chilling codename Maruta. In Japanese, it means logs. Because to a lumber mill, a log is not a living thing. A log is just raw material, something to be cut, burned, and destroyed. Inside this facility, the laws of nature and the laws of God do not apply. The commander of this unit is a man named Shiro Ishii, a brilliant surgeon, a charismatic leader, and a man without a soul. He believes that to win the next war, Japan must master the ultimate weapon, biology itself. But to understand how to kill the human body efficiently, he believes one must study it while it is still. The horrors that happened here were so extreme that for decades, the world refused to believe they were real. It sounds like the plot of a twisted horror movie. But this wasn't a movie. There were no actors. There were no special effects. And worst of all, there was no escape. Welcome to Unit 731. The story you are about to hear is true, and it is worse than anything you can imagine. Inside the walls of Pingfan, the deception was perfect. To the untrained eye, it looked like a high-tech university campus. There were well-maintained laboratories, a library, and even a Shinto shrine. The doctors wore clean white coats. They spoke in the polite, clinical language of medicine. But these men had forgotten their Hippocratic oath. They weren't there to save lives. They were there to calculate exactly how much pain a human body could endure before it broke. The heart of this facility wasn't the operating room. It was the breeding ground. Deep in the complex, there were rooms filled with thousands of wire cages. Inside them were millions of rats. The noise was deafening, a constant, scratching, squeaking drone that echoed off the concrete walls. These rats were being farmed on an industrial scale, not for food, but for their passengers, fleas. Unit 731 was breeding billions of plague-infected fleas, preparing to drop them like rain over enemy cities. But before they could kill millions outside, they had to practice on the logs inside. The prisoners were kept in the row block, a prison hidden deep within the main building so no one from the outside could hear the screams. At first, the prisoners were confused. They were fed well. They were given rice, meat, and alcohol. Why? Because Shiro Ishii needed healthy specimens. You can't get good scientific data from a starving man. He fattened them up, just like livestock, waiting for the slaughter. Then, the winter came. Manchuria is one of the coldest places on Earth, with temperatures dropping to 40 degrees below zero. For most people, this weather was a curse. For Unit 731, it was a weapon. They wanted to know how to treat soldiers fighting in the freezing Russian north. But instead of testing warm clothing, they tested the cold itself. This was the domain of Hisato Yoshimura, a scientist who the guards called the Davy. Yoshimura's experiments were simple, cruel, and scientifically precise. He would drag prisoners out into the snow, stripped bare or with their arms exposed. He would force them to dip their hands into buckets of freezing water, then stand in the biting wind until their arms turned white, then purple, then black. He wasn't satisfied until the limb was frozen solid hard as a rock. Witnesses later described a sound that haunted them forever. When Yoshimura wanted to check if the freezing was complete, he wouldn't use a thermometer. He would take a short, wooden stick and strike the prisoner's frozen finger. Clack, clack. It didn't sound like flesh hitting wood. It sounded like two dry boards hitting each other. The prisoners watched in silent horror as their own bodies turned into dead wood. But the freezing was just the setup. The real experiment was the thawing. But the real nightmare began when the freezing stopped. Yoshimura wasn't just interested in how the body died. He wanted to know how it came back to life. He tested everything. He poured boiling water over the frozen limbs. He held them over open fires. He rubbed them with snow. The results were gruesome. The flesh didn't heal. It peeled off the bone like a wet glove. In his notes, he recorded the temperature at which skin separates from muscle with the same indifference as a man checking the weather. Once the frostbite data was collected, the logs were no longer useful for cold weather testing, but they weren't allowed to die, not yet. They were transferred to the surgical wing for the most infamous procedure in Unit 731E's history, vivisection. In modern medicine, surgery is performed to save a patient. In Unit 731, surgery was performed to study the process of dying. And the most terrifying rule of all? The patient had to be. Shiro Ishii and his team believed that death corrupted the data. They argued that anesthesia might alter the body's natural reaction to pathogens. So, often, there was no painkiller. There was no sleep. Men, women, and even pregnant prisoners were strapped to operating tables, fully conscious, as the surgeons picked up their scalpels. The doctors wanted to see exactly how a disease like anthrax or plague ate through a living lung, or how a heart pumped just seconds before it stopped. One former medical assistant later confessed to the horror he witnessed. He described opening up a young prisoner from chest to stomach. He said, "The fellow knew it was over for him, but when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming." The doctors didn't see a human being in agony. They saw a biological machine malfunctioning. They removed organs one by one: the liver, the kidneys, the brain, weighing them and preserving them in jars of formaldehyde while the patient lay there, still warm. But biology wasn't the only frontier they explored. They also wanted to master the physics of death. In a sealed concrete room, they built a high-tech vacuum chamber. It was designed to simulate high-altitude conditions for pilots. But instead of testing pilots, they tested civilians. They placed a prisoner inside and slowly sucked the air out, lowering the pressure until it was near zero. The observers watched through a thick glass porthole as the laws of physics tore a human body apart. Witnesses described the victims' eyes bulging out of their sockets. Their intestines began to expand, forcing their way out of their bodies. They essentially exploded from the inside out. And all the while, a scientist stood by with a stopwatch, timing exactly how many seconds it took for a human being to disintegrate. By 1944, the experiments were escalating. They weren't just testing individuals anymore. They were testing weapons of mass destruction. Ishii had developed a new delivery system: porcelain bombs, filled with millions of infected fleas. At Pingfan, the experiment stopped being theory and became a production line. Because Ishii did not want papers, he wanted proof that disease could move faster than any army. So warehouses filled with glass flasks, incubators, and steel drums. And the air smelled of disinfectant, masking something sour beneath it. While clerks stamped forms, guards checked locks, and technicians carried cages as if they were carrying ammunition. Past rooms marked with numbers instead of names. Past sinks where blood washed away. Past offices where maps of rail lines and river towns were pinned like targets. And past a quiet room where a radio played jazz, as if normal life could be rehearsed. And every hallway led to one question: how do you deliver an invisible enemy into a living city without firing a bullet out? At the testing grounds, officers studied weather reports like gamblers, waiting for the right wind. Because a biological attack needed silence, not headlines. And the unit trained like a postal service of death, packing, sealing, labeling, and timing every shipment. And when it came, trucks rolled out before dawn and a small aircraft lifted into the low clouds with fragile porcelain canisters in its belly, canisters designed to shatter on impact and release swarms of fleas bred on infected rats. And below, villages woke to quiet streets, to strange dust on rooftops, to insects in bedding, and to water buckets that looked unchanged. Because the weapon was not an explosion, it was a delay, a sickness that arrived days later, turning ordinary fevers into panic and turning neighbors into suspects. Back in Pingfan, the doctors didn't mourn the victims they would never meet. They argued about dosage, about incubation, about which strain survived heat and which died in sunlight. And they plotted curves on graph paper, measuring humidity, counting colonies, and pretending it was pure research, not murder, because numbers can numb the conscience, while prisoners in the roadblock listened to the distant hum of generators and realized the facility was not only a prison, it was a factory feeding the outside world. And each time a report returned from the field notes about contaminated wells, about food supplies seeded with bacteria, about outbreaks that followed troop movements, the staff treated it like a successful weapons test, then sent new requests, more cultures, more fleas, more data, more logs, and then the war began to turn, and the confident voices inside Unit 731 lowered. Because secrets are easy to keep when you are winning, but when defeat approaches, every locked door becomes evidence. So orders were drafted to destroy documents, smash microscopes, poison wells inside the compound, and silence witnesses, even their own guards, who knew too much already, burn cultures, evacuate key staff, and erase the prison population. And as Soviet forces pushed closer and American bombers crossed farther into Japan's skies, Pingfan prepared for August 1945. The empire is collapsing, and the men of Unit 731 feel the walls closing in. Orders move through Pingfan like a cold draft: burn the files, smash the glassware, drain the cultures, and leave nothing for the enemy to seize. Laboratories that once ran all night go dark, then roar back to life with explosions as buildings are rigged with charges. Trucks haul crates of instruments toward the rail line, while other teams pour gasoline over ledgers that recorded human lives as logs for the prisoners. The schedule changes first. Guards stop speaking. Meals arrive late, then not at all. Doors open at odd hours, and footsteps echo in corridors where screams once lived. Witnesses later said that many captives were killed to eliminate evidence. Because a secret this large cannot survive surrender. Smoke rises from pits beyond the walls, mixing with the snow and turning the air bitter and metallic. Shiro, Ishii understands what defeat means: interrogation, trial, and a rope. So he tries to make the truth disappear faster than an army can capture it. He disperses staff, issues false identities, and orders survivors to swear silence. The compound itself is partially destroyed, and what remains is stripped of signs, so that the place can be dismissed as a factory, a farm, or a rumor. Then Japan surrenders, and a second war begins, one fought with documents and bargaining. American investigators want biological warfare knowledge, and Ishii has data soaked in blood. Behind closed doors, deals are discussed, information in exchange for protection. The world hears about Nuremberg, but this story slips into shadows, buried under classified stamps and quiet memos. Years pass, survivors speak, but their voices collide with denial, nationalism, and fear. Some former members build medical careers, some vanish, and some live ordinary lives with extraordinary secrets. In Harbin, the ruins remain, a scar in the landscape, while families search for names that were never written down. Every time a witness describes the word Maruta, it lands like a verdict. The victims were reduced to material, and material can be thrown away, but history has a long memory. Each testimony, each declassified page, each museum display pushes back against the silence. The horror of Unit 731 is not only what happened in the labs, It is what happened afterward, when the truth was traded, delayed, and denied. And that is the final lesson. Evil does not end when the gates close. Sometimes, it survives in the paperwork. At the same time, Soviet forces captured records and staged trials that described germ warfare in chilling detail, while other archives stayed locked for decades. Historians still argue over how much of Ishii's research was used, but the moral stain is clear. The victims never consented, and their suffering cannot be redeemed by results. Today, the site in Harbin has been turned into a memorial museum, where concrete foundations and preserved. In the final weeks, Pingfan didn't feel like a laboratory anymore. It felt like a crime scene being erased in real time. Papers vanished into flames, glass instruments shattered under boots, and entire rooms were stripped down to bare concrete, while trucks rolled out before sunrise, carrying crates that no one was allowed to list on any manifest. The men who once spoke proudly about breakthroughs now spoke in whispers, because they understood a simple truth. If the gates opened for the wrong army, everything inside would become evidence. When Japan surrendered, Unit 731 did not end cleanly the way wars do in textbooks. It dissolved into scattered uniforms, false names, and quiet promises to never speak again. Some witnesses later described prisoners being killed, so there would be no living proof, because a secret built on human bodies cannot survive daylight. The facility itself was damaged and abandoned in pieces, leaving behind foundations, rubble, and the kind of silence that makes a place feel cursed. And then a different kind of battle began, one fought with interrogations, paperwork, and bargaining. Investigators wanted information on biological warfare, and Ishii's people had data that could not be recreated without committing the same evil again. Behind closed doors, deals were made, stories were softened, and responsibility blurred, while survivors and victims, families carried a pain that could not be negotiated away. This is one of the darkest parts of the story. Not only what was done, but how easily the world can look away when knowledge is on the table. Decades later, the truth still arrives in fragments. Testimony here, a declassified document there, a ruined building that refuses to disappear. The science was never the point. The point was power, and the victims were treated like objects, because objects don't have rights. Unit 731 proves that modern technology is not automatically modern morality. A white coat is not a conscience, a clipboard is not a soul, and a research program can become a machine that eats humanity while calling itself progress. So, if this story feels like a horror movie, remember the most frightening detail. It happened without monsters, without magic, and without ghosts. It happened through routine, through schedules, checklists, approvals, and people choosing career, country, or curiosity over compassion. The only way to defeat something like that is memory, because denial is the oxygen that future atrocities breathe. Say the victims were human, say the crime was real, and never let anyone turn a place like Pingfan into a footnote. When the war ended, the story of Unit 731 should have exploded into the headlines, but instead, it sank into the quiet shadows of classified intelligence. Shiro Ishii knew he was not just a general, he was a businessman holding a rare asset, years of human experimentation data. He understood that knowledge, even knowledge soaked in blood, has value. And he was right. American investigators arrived in Japan with a mission: find out what the enemy knew about biological warfare. They discovered a nightmare, but they also saw an opportunity. In a series of secret interrogations, a deal was struck. Ishii and his top doctors would hand over their research, their notes on plague, anthrax, frostbite, and more, and in exchange, the United States would grant them immunity from prosecution. While Nazi doctors were being tried at Nuremberg, the doctors of Unit 731 walked free. Some returned to prominent positions in Japan's medical community. For decades, the victims and their families were met with official denial. The Japanese government claimed there was no proof. The American government kept the files sealed. The horror of Pingfan was dismissed as a rumor, a ghost story from the war. Survivors were left to carry the weight of a memory that the world refused to acknowledge. But history cannot be buried forever. In the 1980s, evidence began to surface. A Japanese professor uncovered a logbook. A former member decided to speak. Declassified American documents revealed the cover-up in chilling detail. Slowly, painstakingly, the truth was pieced together. Today, the site of Unit 731 in Harbin is a museum. The concrete foundations of the prison blocks, the incinerators, and the labs have been preserved. They stand as a silent, unshakable witness to the crimes committed there. Each year, thousands of visitors walk through the ruins, confronting the reality of what happens when science loses its soul. The story of Unit 731 is a warning. It shows that evil is not always loud and monstrous. Sometimes it is quiet, bureaucratic, and wears a lab coat. It reminds us that truth can be traded for power, and that justice can be delayed for decades. The greatest horror of Unit 731 is not just what they did to their victims, but the silence that followed. And the only way to honor those who were lost is to refuse to be silent any longer. The most terrifying part of the Unit 731 story isn't the blood, or the frostbite, or the plague. It is what happened to the men who held the scalpels. They didn't vanish into the dark. They didn't go to prison. They went home. They returned to their wives and children. They became pillars of society. One of the unit's top officers became the dean of a prestigious medical school. Another founded a major pharmaceutical company. For decades, the hands that tortured innocent people were the same hands that delivered babies and performed life-saving surgeries in modern Japan. This leaves us with a question that is harder to swallow than any pill. When you look at a medical textbook today, specifically chapters on treating hypothermia or frostbite, you're looking at data that was bought with human lives. Modern science knows exactly how long a human can survive in freezing water because Shiro Ishii's team timed it with a stopwatch. We use this knowledge to save people today. But is it right? Does using that data honor the victims? Or does it make us accomplices to their murder? Shiro Ishii, the architect of this hell, died of throat cancer in 1959. He died in a comfortable bed, surrounded by his family, a free man. He never faced a judge. He never wore handcuffs. He took his secrets to the grave, protected by the very governments that claimed to fight for justice. The logs of Pingfan were burned, but the smoke from those fires still hangs over the history of the 20th century, reminding us that sometimes the bad guys win. History is often written by the victors, but the truth is written in the scars of the survivors. Unit 731 proves that science without morality is just a sophisticated way to be savage. It forces us to look in the mirror and ask, how much are we willing to ignore in the name of progress? The facility in Harbin is quiet now. The snow still falls on the ruins, covering the concrete bones of a factory that manufactured death. But if you listen closely to the wind, you can almost hear the voices that were silenced, demanding that we never forget. If you made it to the end of this video, you have witnessed one of the darkest chapters of human existence. It's not an easy story to hear, but it is a necessary one. If we forget the past, we are doomed to repeat it. And in a world where technology is advancing faster than our ethics, that danger is more real than ever. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the untold, the hidden, and the forbidden parts of history. If this story moved you, horrified you, or opened your eyes, please hit the like button. It helps us share these stories with the world. And make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the history books are full of secrets, and we are going to find them all. While Shiro Ishii and his top scientists traded their secrets for freedom with the Americans, another world power was closing in from the north. In August 1945, the Soviet Red Army stormed through Manchuria, capturing not only the ruined facility at Pingfan, but also a number of lower-ranking Unit 731 personnel who weren't fast enough to escape. For these men, there would be no quiet deal. There would be no immunity. There would be a... In December 1949, in the remote city of Khabarovsk, The Soviet Union held a public war crimes trial. For 12 days, the world was given its first, and for a long time only, detailed look inside the horrors of Unit 731. The accused Japanese soldiers and scientists stood before a military tribunal and confessed to everything. They described breeding plague-infected fleas. They detailed human vivisections. They admitted to testing biological weapons on living. The evidence was overwhelming. The Soviets presented interrogation transcripts, physical evidence recovered from the labs, and detailed scientific documents outlining the entire germ warfare program. The defendants spoke in chillingly simple terms about their work. One testified how they would check if a prisoner was still alive during an experiment. Another described dropping porcelain bombs filled with anthrax over Chinese villages. For the first time, the word Maruta was spoken in a court of law, but the West wasn't listening. In the heated climate of the Cold War, American and European officials dismissed the Khabarovsk trials as pure Soviet propaganda, a show trial designed to embarrass Japan and its new ally, the United States. The detailed confessions and mountains of evidence were ignored, buried under layers of political mistrust. While the truth was being spoken aloud in a Soviet courtroom, the rest of the world chose to believe the comfortable lie that it was all fake. The Soviet court found all 12 defendants guilty. They were sentenced to between 2 and 25 years in a Siberian labor camp. Compared to the executions handed down at Nuremberg, the sentences were light, but compared to the complete freedom and prestigious careers given to Ishii and his inner circle by the Americans, it was the only justice the victims of Unit 731 would ever see. The trial transcripts were published, but they remained largely unread outside the Soviet bloc for nearly half a century. It wasn't until the Cold War ended that historians began to look back and realize the terrible truth. The propaganda was real. The Khabarovsk trials were not a show. They were a detailed, factual, and horrifying preview of the secrets the United States had agreed to bury. The quest for justice had been sacrificed for a perceived military advantage, leaving the full story of Unit 731 fractured and incomplete for decades. For decades, the defenders of Unit 731 claimed that the stories of underground torture chambers were just myths. They said the facility was destroyed, the evidence was gone, and the witnesses were lying. But the Earth remembers what people try to forget. In May 2023, nearly 80 years after the war ended, archaeologists in Heilongjiang province made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the historical community. Buried 5 feet beneath the field near the city of Anda, they found it. It was a massive, U-shaped concrete bunker, hidden from the world since 1945. This wasn't just a basement, it was the special purpose testing site that Shiro Ishii had tried so hard to erase. The structure matched the declassified blueprints perfectly. Interrogations rooms, holding cells, and corridors designed to contain biological agents. The discovery proved that no matter how much concrete you pour over a crime, the truth will eventually rise to the surface. This new evidence reminds us that the victims were not just numbers in a logbook. They were real people, with names, families, and dreams. People like Han Xiaoyun, a young mother captured by the Kempite. People like the Soviet soldiers who vanished from the border. Inside the museum in Harbin today, there is a display that breaks the heart of every visitor. It shows a pair of shoes, tiny, worn-out shoes belonging to a child. Because Unit 731 didn't just target soldiers, they targeted anyone who could bleed. Today, the relationship between Japan and its neighbors is still scarred by this history. While Germany built memorials at Auschwitz and apologized to the world, the legacy of Unit 731 remains a sensitive, often silent wound in Asia. Textbooks are rewritten, politicians visit controversial shrines, and the full scope of the horror is often downplayed. This is why independent creators, historians, and viewers like you are so important. We are the new archivists. We tell this story not to spread hatred against modern Japan. The generations born after the war are not responsible for the sins of their grandfathers. We tell this story to warn the future, in a world where bioweapons are still a threat, where gain-of-function research is debated in newsrooms, and where governments still keep secrets in the name of national security. The lessons of Pingfan are more urgent than Eve. Science is a tool, like a hammer. You can use it to build a house, or you can use it to crush a skull. The difference isn't in the tool, it's in the hand that holds it. Unit 731 showed us what happens when that hand is guided by cruelty and protected by silence. Thank you for joining us on this long, dark journey into the heart of human evil. It has been a difficult series to make, and a difficult one to watch, but by watching it, you have honored the memory of the Maruta, the logs who were, in the end, human beings. If you believe this history deserves to be remembered, most history books tell you that Unit 731 ended in 1945. They tell you the facility was destroyed and the doctors scattered, but that is a lie. The true ending didn't happen in Manchuria. It happened in Maryland, USA. While the ashes of Pingfan were still smoldering, a top-secret American intelligence team arrived in Tokyo. Their mission wasn't to punish the war criminals. It was to recruit them. The Cold War was beginning, and the United States was terrified of the Soviet Union. American generals believed that biological weapons would decide the next world war. They knew Shiro Ishii had data that no Western scientist could ever legally obtain. He knew exactly how much anthrax it took to kill a child. He knew exactly how long it took for a man to die of plague. The Americans wanted that data, and Shiro Ishii knew it. In a series of secret meetings, Ishii made his final negotiation. He offered 8,000 slides of human tissue, thousands of pages of research notes, and the results of 20 years of murder. In exchange, he asked for one thing: immunity. The deal was accepted. The United States government paid Ishii and his team a sum of 250,000 yen, a fortune at the time. The files were packed into crates and shipped, not to a courtroom, but to Camp Detrick, now Fort Detrick in Maryland, the center of the U.S. biological warfare program. Think about that for a second. The foundation of modern American biological defense was built on the torture of innocent people in China. Dr. Edwin Hill, a top scientist, wrote a secret memo justifying the deal. He said, "The evidence gathered has greatly supplemented and amplified our previous findings. It was obtained with the expenditure of a few $100,000, a mere pittance." To him, the victims weren't people, they were a bargain. Rumors have circulated for decades that Shiro Ishii himself traveled to Maryland to advise us scientists. While official records are scrubbed, witnesses claim to have seen him walking the halls of Fort Detrick. Whether he was physically there or not, his spirit was. The Ishii network continued to correspond with American researchers for years, answering questions about how to spread disease effectively. The weapons developed during the Cold War carried the DNA of Unit. This is why the story of Unit 731 was hidden for so long. It wasn't just a Japanese secret, it was an American secret too. By granting immunity to these monsters, the West became an accomplice to their crimes. The justice that the victims deserved was traded away for a stack of papers and a filing cabinet. So when you look at the world today, at the labs, the viruses, and the biodefense programs, remember where the data came from. The ghost of Unit 731 isn't buried in China. It's buried in the archives of the superpowers who promised to keep us safe. And that is the final uncomfortable truth. The war ended, but the research never stopped. For real this time. Thank you for watching. We often think that wars end when a treaty is signed. The guns stop firing, the soldiers go home, and the killing stops. But for the people living around Harbin, the end of World War II was just the beginning of a new, silent horror. When Shiro Ishii ordered the destruction of Unit 731 in August 1945, his men didn't have time to kill all the test animals. In their panic to escape the Soviets, they simply opened the cages. Thousands of rats, bred specifically to carry the bubonic plague, scurried out of the burning complex and into the surrounding countryside. Millions of infected fleas were released into the wind. They didn't know the war was over. They were biological machines, programmed to do one thing: hunt for a host. And the nearest hosts were the innocent farmers of Heilongjiang province. In the winter of 1946, a year after peace was declared, strange sicknesses began to sweep through the villages near the ruins of Pingfan. Entire families would fall ill with high fevers, blackening skin, and swollen lymph nodes, the classic symptoms of the Black Death. But these villagers had no idea what was happening. They had no medicine. They had no doctors. They were fighting a medieval disease weaponized by modern science. Chinese records from this period are heartbreaking. In some villages, there were not enough living people left to bury the dead. Houses stood empty, their doors flapping in the wind, with meals still left on the tables. It is estimated that between 1946 and 1948, over 30,000 people in the region died from plague epidemics caused by the escaped experiments of Unit 731. These victims are rarely counted in the official death tolls of World War II. Because they died in peacetime, this terror wasn't accidental. It was the final act of negligence by a unit that viewed human life as disposable. Even as they fled, the Japanese officers knew exactly what would happen when they released those animals. They simply didn't care. To them, the Chinese population was just part of the landscape, collateral damage in a war that was already lost. The ghost plague of Manchuria serves as a terrifying reminder of the nature of biological weapons. Unlike a bomb, which explodes and is finished, a biological weapon is a living thing. It reproduces, it spreads, it doesn't respect borders, and it doesn't respect peace treaties. Once you open Pandora's box, you cannot close it. The suffering caused by Unit 731 continued to echo through generations, scarring the land long after the last Japanese soldier had surrendered. Today, if you travel to these villages, you can still find older people who remember the years of the black sickness. They remember the smell of burning bodies, the quarantine lines, and the fear of the invisible enemy. Their stories are the final testimony against Shiro, Ishii, proof that his crimes didn't end with a signature on the deck of the USS Missouri. They ended only when there was no one left to kill.